One of the most pivotal events in Middle Eastern history wasn't decided on a battlefield, but in the shadows of British and American intelligence offices. In 1953, a covert operation by the CIA and MI6 toppled Iran's democratic government, setting off decades of turmoil and shaping the nation's destiny. To understand today's Iran and its fraught relationship with the West, we must uncover the story of ambition, betrayal, and the struggle for sovereignty that began in those secret rooms. Iran's story stretches back to the mighty Persian Empire. Known as the Achaemenid Empire, it emerged in the 6th century BCE under Cyrus the Great, becoming the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen. At its peak, it stretched from the Indus Valley in the east to the Aegean Sea in the west, encompassing modern-day Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Egypt, and parts of Central Asia and the Caucasus. This vast empire was notable not only for its size, but also for its relatively tolerant approach to governing diverse populations. Cyrus the Great established a model of governance that respected local customs, religions, and traditions. The famous Cyrus Cylinder, often called the First Charter of Human Rights, proclaimed religious freedom and the repatriation of displaced peoples. This approach to empire building was revolutionary for its time, and helped establish Persian rule as legitimate across vast cultural and geographic distances. The Persian Empire was divided into satrapies, or provinces, each governed by a satrap who answered directly to the Persian king, known as the King of Kings or Shahanshah. This system allowed for efficient administration of the vast territory while maintaining central control. The Persians built an extensive network of roads, most famously the Royal Road, which facilitated communication and trade across the empire. Persian culture synthesized influences from across their vast domains while maintaining distinctive characteristics. Zoroastrianism, founded by the prophet Zoroaster, became the empire's dominant religion, emphasizing the cosmic struggle between good and evil, the importance of individual choice, and concepts that would later influence Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Persian art, architecture, and literature flourished, creating lasting cultural legacies that continue to influence Iranian identity today. The Persian Empire faced numerous challenges over its long history. External pressures came from Greek city-states, particularly during the Greco-Persian Wars of the 5th century BCE, when battles like Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis became legendary. While the Persians were ultimately unsuccessful in conquering Greece, they continued to rule their vast empire for another 150 years. The decisive blow came from Alexander the Great, who conquered the Persian Empire between 334 and 331 BCE. Alexander's conquest marked the end of the Achaemenid dynasty, but Persian culture and administrative practices significantly influenced the Hellenistic kingdoms that followed. The Parthian Empire, from 247 BCE to 224 CE, and the Sasanian Empire, from 224 to 651 CE, later restored Persian rule. But the Arab conquest in the 7th century CE marked the end of the ancient Persian imperial tradition. After centuries of Arab, Mongol, and Turkic rule, Persia experienced a cultural and political renaissance under the Safavid dynasty, from 1501 to 1736. The Safavids established Shia Islam as the state religion, distinguishing Persia from its Sunni Ottoman neighbors, and creating a religious identity that remains central to Iranian nationalism today. This period saw a flourishing of Persian art, architecture, and literature, with Isfahan becoming one of the world's most beautiful cities. The Safavid period also established many of the territorial boundaries that would later define modern Iran. However, the dynasty gradually weakened due to internal strife, economic difficulties, and external pressures from the Ottomans and Russians. The 18th and early 19th centuries saw Persia become increasingly fragmented and vulnerable to foreign influence. The Qajar dynasty, from 1789 to 1925, marked a crucial transition period in Iranian history. While the Qajars succeeded in reunifying much of Persia, they also presided over a period of increasing foreign interference and territorial losses. The Anglo-Persian Wars, from 1856 to 1857, and Russian expansion into the Caucasus and Central Asia significantly reduced Persian territory and influence. More importantly, the Qajar period saw the beginning of systematic Western economic penetration. the discovery of oil in Persia in 1908 by the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later BP, would prove to be a turning point in the country's relationship with the West. European powers began to view Persia primarily through the lens of strategic and economic interests, rather than as a sovereign nation with its own aspirations. The Qajar Shahs, desperate for revenue and often poorly advised, granted numerous concessions to foreign companies and governments. These concessions, covering everything from telegraph lines to tobacco sales, increasingly placed Persian economic life under foreign control. The infamous tobacco concession of 1890, which granted a British company monopoly rights over tobacco production and sales, sparked the first major popular uprising against foreign economic domination. The Constitutional Revolution of 1905 to 1911 represented Persia's first major attempt at democratic reform and modernization. Influenced by constitutional movements elsewhere and frustrated by Qajar autocracy and foreign interference, a coalition of clerics, merchants, and intellectuals demanded limitations on royal power and the establishment of a parliament. The revolution succeeded in establishing Iran's first constitution and parliament, but the new system remained fragile. Foreign powers, particularly Britain and Russia, were suspicious of democratic movements that might threaten their interests. The Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907 effectively divided Persia into spheres of influence, with Britain controlling the south and Russia the north, leaving only a small central zone under nominal Persian control. In 1921, Reza Khan, a military officer, staged a coup that would fundamentally transform Persia. Initially serving as Minister of War, Reza Khan gradually consolidated power and, in 1925, deposed the last Qajar Shah to establish the Pahlavi dynasty. He took the name Reza Shah Pahlavi and embarked on an ambitious program of modernization and centralization. Reza Shah's rule, from 1925 to 1941, was characterized by rapid modernization, secularization, and the assertion of central government control over all aspects of Iranian life. He officially changed the country's name from Persia to Iran in 1935, emphasizing its Aryan heritage and connections to modern nationalism. His reforms included the construction of the Trans-Iranian Railway, the establishment of Tehran University, the introduction of modern legal codes, and campaigns for literacy and public health. While Reza Shah's modernization efforts brought Iran into the 20th century, his methods were often harsh and autocratic. He centralized power, suppressed tribal autonomy, and implemented forced modernization policies that alienated traditional segments of society. His dress code reforms, which banned traditional clothing and required Western attire, were particularly controversial among religious communities. Reza Shah also pursued a policy of reducing foreign influence, particularly British control over Iran's oil industry. However, his flirtation with Nazi Germany during the 1930s concerned the Allies, who viewed Iranian oil as crucial to the war effort. In 1941, British and Soviet forces invaded Iran, forcing Reza Shah to abdicate in favor of his young son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The discovery of oil in Iran fundamentally altered the country's relationship with the outside world. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, or AIOC, had been granted a concession in 1901 that gave it exclusive rights to explore, extract, and export Iranian oil for 60 years. The terms of this agreement were extraordinarily favorable to the British company and unfavorable to Iran. Under the original concession and subsequent agreements, Iran received only a small percentage of oil revenues while the AIOC reaped enormous profits. By the late 1940s, Iranian oil was generating hundreds of millions of pounds in revenue for Britain, while Iran received only a fraction of this amount. This disparity became increasingly galling to Iranian nationalists, who saw their country's most valuable resource enriching foreign powers, while Iranians remained poor. The situation was made worse by the AIOC's treatment of Iranian workers and its refusal to allow Iranian participation in management or technical operations. The company operated as a state within a state, with its own housing compounds, hospitals, and schools that excluded Iranians. This colonial-style operation became a symbol of foreign domination and national humiliation. Mohammad Mossadegh emerged as the leading voice of Iranian nationalism in the post-war period. An aristocrat educated in Europe, Mossadegh had been involved in Iranian politics since the constitutional revolution, and had consistently opposed foreign interference in Iranian affairs. In 1949 he formed the National Front, a coalition of parties and groups united by their opposition to foreign control of Iranian oil. Mossadegh's political philosophy combined Iranian nationalism with democratic principles and social justice. He believed that Iran could only achieve true independence and prosperity by asserting control over its natural resources and reducing foreign influence. His eloquent speeches and principled stance made him enormously popular among ordinary Iranians who had grown tired of seeing their country's wealth flow to foreign powers. The National Front's platform called for the nationalization of the oil industry, democratic government, and economic development. Mossadegh argued that oil revenues should be used to modernize Iran's economy, improve education and healthcare, and reduce the country's dependence on foreign powers. This message resonated strongly with Iranian public opinion across class and regional lines. In March 1951, the Iranian parliament passed legislation nationalizing the oil industry and establishing the National Iranian Oil Company. Shortly afterwards, Mossadegh was appointed prime minister, making him responsible for implementing the nationalization policy. The British government and the AIOC were outraged by this decision and immediately began planning their response. Britain's initial reaction was to impose a comprehensive embargo on Iranian oil, preventing Iran from selling its oil on international markets. The Royal Navy blockaded Iranian ports to prevent oil exports, while British diplomats pressured other countries not to purchase Iranian oil. This economic warfare succeeded in dramatically reducing Iranian oil revenues, but it failed to break Iranian resolve. The British government also began planning more direct action against Mossadegh's government. Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden viewed the nationalization as a direct challenge to British interests and a dangerous precedent that might encourage other oil-producing countries to follow suit. They began exploring options for removing Mossadegh from power, including economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and ultimately covert action. Faced with an empty treasury and a crippling blockade, Mossadegh's government called upon the Iranian people for support, and they responded with remarkable solidarity. The struggle against Britain was framed as a national jihad, a righteous cause that demanded sacrifice. To keep the government afloat, Mossadegh issued national bonds, and people from all walks of life, from wealthy merchants to poor peasants, lined up to invest their life savings in the cause, demonstrating their unwavering faith in his leadership. The economic pain was real, but it was overshadowed by a powerful surge of national pride and defiance. The shared struggle forged a powerful bond between the leader and his people, creating a level of national unity rarely seen in Iran's history. The popular support for Mossadegh was palpable on the streets. Massive demonstrations became a regular feature of life in Tehran, with hundreds of thousands of people marching to denounce British imperialism and chant their support for the prime minister. These rallies were not orchestrated by the state but were genuine outpourings of popular sentiment. Mossadegh's government, despite the immense external pressure, remained committed to democratic principles. The press was free, and political debate, while heated, was open. This period, despite its economic difficulties, really represented a golden age of political freedom and popular participation in Iran, a stark contrast to the authoritarianism that had preceded it and that which would follow. Britain, however, was not content to rely on economic pressure alone. As the blockade failed to dislodge Mossadegh, intelligence operatives from MI6 began to plot a covert operation to overthrow him. They initiated a campaign of black propaganda to spread disinformation and sow discord, and they actively sought to bribe Iranian politicians, military officers, and tribal leaders to turn against the government. These early British attempts at orchestrating a coup were clumsy and largely ineffective, failing to gain traction against Mossadegh's immense popularity. Frustrated and unable to succeed on their own, the British began to look across the Atlantic for a partner. Initially, the American administration of President Harry S. Truman had been somewhat sympathetic to Iran's cause, viewing the dispute as a symptom of outdated British colonialism. However, the political climate in Washington was about to change dramatically. The election of Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1952 brought to power an administration that viewed the world through the rigid, paranoid lens of the Cold War. British diplomats, led by the newly returned Prime Minister Winston Churchill, began to persistently and skillfully play on American fears, reframing the Iranian crisis. It was no longer a nationalist dispute over oil, they argued, but a dangerous slide towards communism that threatened to deliver Iran and its vital resources into the hands of the Soviet Union. This argument would find a very receptive audience in Washington's new leadership. For 2 years, Britain stood alone against Mossadegh, as the U.S. under Truman urged compromise. But in January 1953, Eisenhower's new administration saw Iran through a Cold War lens. Nationalism became suspect, and Mossadegh a liability. Fearing Soviet influence, Washington decided Mossadegh had to go. John Foster and Allen Dulles, fierce anti-communists, shaped U.S. policy in Iran. Backed by Eisenhower, the CIA, led by Allen, launched Operation Ajax, using propaganda, bribes, and staged chaos to topple Mossadegh. It was a blueprint for covert intervention, forever changing Iran's fate. The operation was planned and executed by CIA agent Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt. The plan involved using Iranian assets, propaganda campaigns, and direct action to destabilize Mossadegh's government and install a more compliant regime. The American decision to participate in the coup was influenced by several factors. First, there was growing concern that Iran might fall into the Soviet sphere of influence, particularly given the presence of the Communist Tudeh Party in Iranian politics. Second, American oil companies were eager to gain access to Iranian oil markets that had previously been monopolized by the British. Finally, the Eisenhower administration was committed to a more aggressive approach to containing communism globally. The coup plot involved multiple elements designed to create chaos and justify military intervention. These included bribing Iranian officials, organizing demonstrations, spreading propaganda, and coordinating with Iranian military officers opposed to Mossadegh. The operation used both royalist supporters of the Shah and religious conservatives opposed to Mossadegh's secular policies. The initial attempt to execute the coup in August 1953 failed when loyal military units refused to arrest Mossadegh. The Shah, who had been informed of the plot, fled the country when the coup appeared to have failed. However, CIA operatives on the ground, particularly Kermit Roosevelt, refused to abandon the operation and continued working to destabilize the government. The successful coup came on August 19, 1953, when military units loyal to the Shah, supported by crowds organized by CIA operatives, overwhelmed government forces and arrested Mossadegh. The operation succeeded in part because of the economic crisis caused by the oil embargo, which had weakened popular support for the government, and because of divisions within the National Front coalition. Following the coup, Mohammad Reza Shah returned to Iran and began consolidating his power with the support of Western nations. Mossadegh was tried and sentenced to house arrest, where he remained until he died in 1967. The National Front was disbanded, and many of its leaders were imprisoned or forced into exile. The new government quickly moved to resolve the oil crisis in terms favorable to Western interests. The Consortium Agreement of 1954 granted American and European oil companies a 40% share in Iranian oil production, thereby breaking the British monopoly while ensuring continued Western control. Iran received a larger share of oil revenues than under the AIOC concession, but the principle of national control over natural resources was abandoned. The Shah, now firmly in power with Western backing, began building an authoritarian state with the help of American and British advisors. The Savak secret police established with CIA assistance became notorious for its brutal suppression of political opposition. The coup thus marked the beginning of 25 years of authoritarian rule that would ultimately lead to the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The most obvious and enduring reason for Western interference in Iranian affairs has been oil. The Middle East holds over half of the world's known oil reserves. Since the early 20th century, Western powers, especially Britain, France, and later the United States, have regarded control over Middle Eastern oil as crucial to their economic and military power. Iran's oil resources were particularly significant because they were among the first to be developed in the Middle East, and due to Iran's strategic location. The Anglo-Persian oil company's Iranian operations provided crucial fuel for the Royal Navy during both World Wars and generated enormous profits for British shareholders. By the 1950s, Iranian oil had become central to Britain's post-war economic recovery and its ability to maintain global influence. The West consistently supported regimes that guaranteed oil supply regardless of how repressive they were. This pattern can be seen in Western support for Saudi Arabia's absolute monarchy, Iran under the Shah, and Iraq under early Saddam Hussein. The 1953 coup in Iran happened largely because Iran had nationalized its oil, an act that Britain and the United States could not tolerate, as it threatened the entire system of Western control over Middle Eastern energy resources. Beyond the immense underground wealth, the land of Iran itself occupies an extraordinarily strategic piece of global real estate. The country sits astride major land and sea routes connecting east and west, making it a natural point of competition between great powers. During the 19th century, Iran became a focal point of the great game between Britain and Russia, with both empires seeking to control or influence Iranian territory. In the Cold War era, Iran's proximity to the Soviet Union made it a crucial component of Western containment strategy. The United States viewed Iran as a vital bulwark against Soviet expansion into the Middle East and South Asia. This strategic importance was enhanced by Iran's proximity to major oil-producing regions and shipping routes, particularly the Strait of Hormuz, through which a significant percentage of the world's oil passes. Iran's strategic location also made it valuable for intelligence gathering and military operations. During the Cold War, Iran served as a base for U.S. intelligence operations aimed at monitoring Soviet activities. The country's long border with the Soviet Union and its position overlooking the Persian Gulf made it an ideal location for early warning systems and military bases. The loss of Iran to the Soviet sphere of influence was therefore considered an unthinkable strategic catastrophe. The West's desire to project military power, secure trade routes, and contain regional rivals means that what happens within Iran's borders is never seen as a purely internal matter. The nation's geography has been both a blessing and a curse, granting it regional influence but also making it a perpetual target for foreign meddling, ensuring that its destiny is rarely left entirely in its own hands. After World War I, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire created a power vacuum in the Middle East that Britain and France moved to fill. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 divided Ottoman territories between the two powers, creating artificial borders and installing compliant monarchies. While Iran was not directly partitioned, like the Ottoman territories, it was significantly affected by this restructuring of the Middle East. The new Middle Eastern order established by Western powers created a system of client states and spheres of influence that persisted long after formal colonialism ended. Iran, like other Middle Eastern countries, found its sovereignty limited by informal Western control over key economic and strategic resources. This system was justified by Western powers as bringing modernity and stability to a region they viewed as backward and chaotic. Western powers often portrayed themselves as guardians of progress and civilization, using their dominance to justify civilizing missions that were often code for resource control and military access. This paternalistic attitude helped justify continued interference in Iranian and Middle Eastern affairs even after these countries achieved formal independence. Western powers have consistently argued that their involvement in the Middle East is necessary for regional stability and security. During the Cold War, this meant preventing Soviet influence and supporting pro-Western regimes. After the Cold War, it has meant combating terrorism, preventing the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and maintaining the flow of oil. However, Western definitions of stability have often differed significantly from those of Middle Eastern peoples. Stability for Western powers has typically meant maintaining friendly regimes and ensuring continued access to resources, even when those regimes were unpopular or repressive. This approach has often led to support for authoritarian rulers who could guarantee Western interests but lacked legitimacy among their own people. The emphasis on stability has also led to Western opposition to popular movements and democratic reforms that might threaten established arrangements. In Iran's case, Mossadegh's democratic government was seen as a threat to stability, not because it was undemocratic, but because it challenged Western control over Iranian oil and might inspire similar movements elsewhere. From the Cold War to the War on Terror, Western governments have feared ideologies that threaten their influence in the Middle East. These have included Pan-Arabism, exemplified by Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, Islamic Revolution as in Iran after 1979, leftist nationalism, such as Mossadegh's movement, and various forms of terrorism, from Al-Qaeda to ISIS. Western concern about these ideologies has often been less about their inherent character than about their potential to challenge Western-led world order or threaten economic and military interests. Democratic movements have been opposed when they threatened Western interests, while authoritarian regimes have been supported when they served Western purposes. This selective approach to ideology has created considerable resentment in the Middle East, where many people have noted the contradiction between Western advocacy for democracy and human rights and Western support for repressive regimes. The 1953 coup in Iran was a perfect example of this contradiction, as a democratically elected government was overthrown to preserve Western economic interests. While oil has been the most obvious Western interest in the Middle East, other economic considerations have also played important roles. The region has been a major market for Western arms sales, with countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Iran, under the Shah, purchasing billions of dollars worth of weapons and military equipment. The Middle East has also been important for Western financial institutions, construction companies, and other businesses seeking profitable opportunities. The petrodollar recycling system that emerged after the 1973 oil crisis created vast opportunities for Western banks and investment firms to manage Middle Eastern oil revenues. Western powers have also sought to prevent the emergence of economic blocs or arrangements that might challenge their global dominance. The nationalization of Iranian oil was threatening not just because of the immediate economic losses, but because it might encourage other countries to assert greater control over their natural resources. There's also a cultural and ideological dimension to Western interference in the Middle East. The region has often been portrayed in Western media and politics as backward, dangerous, or unstable, making intervention seem necessary or justified. This ties into Orientalist thinking, where the West sees itself as the rational, modern force bringing order to an irrational, chaotic East. This ideological framework has been used to justify various forms of intervention, from direct military action to support for authoritarian regimes. The assumption that Western values and systems are inherently superior has made it easier for Western policymakers to dismiss local preferences and impose external solutions on Middle Eastern societies. The clash of civilizations narrative that emerged after the Cold War reinforced these tendencies, portraying conflicts in the Middle East as fundamental struggles between Western modernity and Islamic traditionalism rather than as political disputes with specific historical and economic roots. This framing has made it more difficult to address the underlying causes of regional conflicts and has often exacerbated tensions rather than resolving them. The 1953 coup against Mohammad Mossadegh represents a watershed moment not only in Iranian history, but in the broader relationship between the West and the Middle East. The operation succeeded in achieving its immediate objectives, removing a nationalist government that threatened Western oil interests and installing a compliant regime. However, the long-term consequences were far more complex and ultimately counterproductive to Western interests. The coup established a pattern of Western interference in Middle Eastern affairs that has persisted to the present day. It demonstrated that Western powers were willing to sacrifice democratic principles and popular sovereignty when their economic and strategic interests were threatened. This lesson was not lost on Middle Eastern populations, who came to view Western rhetoric about democracy and human rights with deep skepticism. In Iran specifically, the coup had profound and lasting effects on political culture and national identity. The overthrow of a popular, democratically elected government created a deep reservoir of resentment against foreign interference that would later fuel the Islamic Revolution. Many Iranians came to view the Pahlavi regime as illegitimate precisely because it had been imposed by foreign powers and maintained through repression. The 1953 coup also marked the beginning of a new phase in the United States' involvement in the Middle East. While the United States had previously played a relatively minor role in the region compared to Britain and France, the success of Operation Ajax encouraged further American interventions. The pattern established in Iran, supporting authoritarian allies against popular movements in the name of stability and anti-communism, would be repeated throughout the Cold War era. Perhaps most tragically, the coup prevented Iran from developing along a democratic nationalist path that might have served both Iranian and Western interests better in the long run. Mossadegh's vision of a modern, democratic Iran controlling its own resources was hardly radical by international standards, but it was unacceptable to Western powers determined to maintain their dominance over Middle Eastern oil. The events of 1953 thus represent both the apex of Western power in the Middle East and the beginning of its long-term decline. While the coup achieved its immediate objectives, it ultimately contributed to the anti-Western sentiment and political instability that would characterize the region for decades to come. Understanding this history is crucial for comprehending not only Iran's subsequent development, but also the broader dynamics of Western involvement in the Middle East that continue to shape international relations today. The story of Iran from ancient Persia to the 1953 coup illustrates the complex interplay between internal development and external interference that has characterized much of the modern Middle East. It shows how the discovery of oil transformed Iran from a peripheral player in international affairs to a central focus of great power competition. Most importantly, it demonstrates how short-term tactical successes in foreign intervention can create long-term strategic problems that persist for generations. As we consider current debates about Western involvement in the Middle East, the Iranian experience from 1901 to 1953 offers important lessons about the limits of external power and the importance of respecting national sovereignty. The coup against Mossadegh may have secured Western access to Iranian oil for a generation, but it also planted the seeds of future conflict that continue to bear bitter fruit today. Thanks for watching, you are appreciated. If you've learned something from this video, leave a comment below and share the video. If you are new here, please subscribe for more deep dives.